We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another School of Public Policy webinar series. My name is Clare Oosterhuis, and I am a field editor with Regenerative Agriculture. I am so excited to be your moderator today. So any questions, comments, feedback, they'll come through me, and I'm very excited to be here with the next, about the next hour or so with you guys. So as I said, thank you for joining us. This webinar is exclusively presented by UFA and RCF. So that's the United Farmers of Alberta and the UFA Rural Communities Foundation. Today's webinar is the third in our series focused on regenerative agricultural practices. We are very pleased to have with us today two experienced farmers who will share their real world experience with regenerative agriculture practices. Before we kind of get started here today, a few housekeeping notes. So if you sat in some of our previous webinars, you will note we have kind of changed the format. So very much looking forward to making this a bit more of an interactive experience. We will be using a SWOT analysis. So that is strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats format to guide our discussion. So our experts talk about the strengths, as well as, like I said, the opportunities, the weaknesses, and the threats related to regenerative agriculture. We also, as a little bit of a change, have included some audience polls. So pending technology works with us how we would like it to. Get your clicking fingers ready to participate, because I believe we have 3 polls throughout the course of this webinar, and we'll be updating you guys with responses and questions. So please be sure to check that out as well. Feel free to post questions in the Q&A box. There will be a specific time at the end of the presentation where we will have a Q&A opportunity. However, I know these questions come up and sometimes it's easy to forget them. So please throw them in the chat box, and I will happily get to them when we have an opportunity, as well as if there is any sort of questions you would like to pose to specific panelists, let me know and I will make sure they get directed in the right way. As well, I have a couple questions in regards to the topic for our panelists, so stay tuned for those. It should be a great discussion. As well as we are kind of changing the format too with the questions. The questions you submit will be public, but you can upvote them. So if someone else asks a question, and you're like, oh, that is a great question, I wonder that too, upvote it and it'll go to the top of the list, and the ones that's kind of the order we will tackle them in. So if you really want a question answered, make sure it gets upvoted, and we'll be happy to do so for me. I think it's there's a check mark. I'm not exactly sure how it appears to you guys, but I believe it's a check mark you guys have to click to upvote it. If you guys are having any issues, please just put it in the chat box and I'll be sure to address that. So today's panelists are Dr. Clare Hintz, who is with the Prescott College and Elsewhere Farms. Dr. Clare Hintz runs Elsewhere Farms in Herbister, Wisconsin, a 40-acre perennial polyculture located near the south shore of Lake Superior. Clare has a PhD in sustainability education with a focus on the regenerative agriculture. And she also is the editor-in-chief of the open source online journal of sustainability education. We also will have Rod Olson, who is of Leaf and Lyre Urban Farms. Rod is one of the original urban farmers in Calgary, and he is a founding member of YYC Growers. His area of interest is in soil and its potential as a living system to support the future of feeding the planet. He focuses on practices that increase water holding capacity, reversing climate change, increasing biodiversity, and the nutrient density of agri-food. So as I said, once again, a huge shout out to our sponsors, UFA and RCF, as this webinar is exclusively presented by them. To actually start off, before we get into a little bit of presentations here, we're going to have the first webinar or the Zoom poll here. And the question we're posing to you guys is, how familiar are you with regenerative agriculture? So you'll see this just popped up on your screen here, and you have three options: not at all, somewhat, or very familiar. So like I said, get those clicking fingers ready, and we will get that going. Okay, Claire, if you could turn on your video, we will get your presentation started. And as I said, please comment on the Zoom poll or put in your questions, and we'll get them over. We'll comment after Claire's presentation. Claire, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for having me. It was really exciting to see so many farmers and industry folk on the attendee list, and happy to be with you today from momentarily sunny northern Wisconsin. I'm going to just switch over to my desktop here so that I can share a couple slides because pictures speak 1,000 words. So what I thought I would do is show you some of what I do on my farm. I wear a lot of hats. I do administrative and policy work regionally, and but I am a full-time farmer and researcher on my farm, and so this experience, I think, really lends itself to the conversation today. This is just a map to show where I am on Lake Superior. I am 50 miles east of Duluth, Minnesota, and not that far across the lake from Thunder Bay. And so this is the reality that we live in. We got about 9 months a year of winter with a pretty heavy snow load. That's where we get about half of our moisture for the year. And so farming regeneratively is necessary to farm in this kind of climate, especially as the climate extremes get worse. We get extreme weather at all times of the year. So I have a couple components to my farm. I've got a 1/4 acre of permanent raised beds. This is a bio-intensive market garden growing, and I've got a little picture here to the right that shows the areas of my farm where those gardens exist. I, as a solo farmer, feed 40 to 50 families throughout the year, 40 in the summer and 15 in the winter. I'm grossing about $30,000 per for the enterprise. So that translates to about $120,000 if you scaled that to an acre. And I am sequestering carbon in this system after about 10 years of this production full time. My soil organic matter is at about 10%. I have really nutrient dense, beautiful soils. Part of that is because I have integrated livestock to my system. So I rotationally graze a rare breed of pig, the American guinea hog, and they rotate through at different times of year, following organic standards. And so they're not in the areas where they're out of areas 3 months before I'm harvesting. And then I also have chickens, laying hens, and those are running through the system as well. And the ability of those animals to reduce pest loads, especially insect pests in my orchards, to provide fertility in all of the areas of my farm, and build organic matter, and to reduce my need to do much weeding, allows for enormous biodiversity here on my farm. I just want to note that I am farming this way because I have to. If I want to make a living as a farmer over the long term and have crops to send to my CSA members, this is critical. So last year we had no rain from May through August, and the only reason I survived is because of the quality of my soils, the intensive production that I had. And then I had drip irrigation and was lucky to have water to use for the drip irrigation. We have spring extremes. Last year I lost all of my tree fruit because we had a very early spring. Everything flowered 2 weeks early. And then we had 3 nights of hard freeze. So as these extremes get worse, regenerative agriculture principles are what I use to survive as a business. And I just want to name a couple of key points in that I'm considering when I'm thinking of regenerative agriculture. So how is it different from the lots of other systems out there? The one key thing that I see that advances regenerative agriculture beyond organic or bio-intensive or permaculture is thinking about how it's a healing system versus a sustaining system. So we have a lot of work to do to restore landscapes and protect and re-add biodiversity. And so this is a system that helps us do that. I've already talked about the resilient food supply. The organic matter in my soils helps hold nutrients and water and clean, helps the watershed stay clean. And then, as I've said many times already, the biodiversity of the farm is huge. And it's providing me a fair livelihood. And that allows me to also add to the economic and social sustainability of my local community. So I'll stop there and let Rob jump in, and look forward to the discussion. Rod, you're on mute, I think.
Is that working out? Okay. So yeah, as Kara mentioned, my name is Rod Olson, and one of the original urban farmers in Calgary, with the farm name of Lyre Urban Farms. One of the things that I realized very early on in that journey is that I needed to have a little bit of support around me, and so the idea for a grower cooperative distribution entity was birthed, and so that's where YYC Growers came. I think really probably 3 years into my work as a farmer, and I think for Leaf and Lyre, my claim, or one of my proudest moments was on less than 1 acre of land, was able to generate over $123,000 in vegetable sales. Now the system wasn't completely up there, so a lot of that went to paying staff that were part of it, but I think that showcasing what is possible on a very small piece of land was really important for me. And so when I get into thinking about regenerative agriculture, this gentleman kind of jumps to the forefront, and the fact that we need to think things a little bit differently. And I think for me, the biggest shift in regenerative agriculture is not necessarily the practices per se, but it's a mindset. And so when our good buddy Einstein, tried to demonstrate that energy, everything is made up of energy, what he was doing is he was putting he was moving away from seeing life as a particle, as a specific thing. So like the Newtonian idea. So one of the experiments that they did was the double split, where they just fired electrons at a space, and was it a particle or was it a wave? And they basically came up with the idea that it's both end. And so I think for me, when I think about regenerative agriculture, we can't treat it as a silver bullet solution. It has to be something that really is about our ecosystem awareness. And part of that for me is a lot like, so this is a picture of one of our customers at YYC Growers, super passionate about feeding and nurturing her daughter. And so I think with farming and regenerative, it's almost like we take land as a part of the equation. It's our, in a sense, our children, maybe it's our parent. At any rate, we need to listen to it and make it part of the system. And what's fascinating about this is that Michelle's daughter doesn't actually enjoy eating the conventionally grown stuff that she can get at the big box store. And so like flavor and nutrition are parallel, and with regenerative practices, that's one of the things that it also is offering to us as humanity, not just carbon sequestration, water retention, but also really great tasting food that creates higher health outcomes. And then the other thing for me about regenerative agriculture is that it is us working together. Like, so don't farm alone is really a theory that I follow. And so these are some of the different farm operations that are part of YWC Growers. And you'll see like if there's indoor, there's greenhouse, there's broadacre, there's small farm intensive like myself. And what that produces at the end is that these systems, so on the left, you see the soil and plants, so our farmers are really kind of engaged in that system. And then on the right, people really kind of caring about their health and vitality. And then in the middle here, YWC Growers is trying to build that bridge so that there's a benefit to both sides of those ecosystems on either side. So again, just met Clare last week. We're going to be fast friends, and I really look forward to the conversation carrying on.
Awesome. Thank you both. That's our audience is going to find it very interesting, I'm sure. So we do actually have some results from that first poll. So we'll pull them up here. So just to remind you guys, how familiar are you with regenerative agriculture? So 22% of you said not at all, 63% said somewhat, and 15% said very familiar. So kind of an even split there. And I think that's actually, you talk to a lot of farmers around here, the answer is somewhat. It's a big beast, and there's a lot to unravel there. Before we kind of get into more of a discussion here, we're going to head into our second poll here. So our second poll is, do you think that regenerative agriculture presents more benefits than challenges? And you have a yes and a no option. Let's just make sure we get that up here. On the back end, we just got to get the questions going, and then we can get, yeah, so there you see it popping up. Do you think regenerative agriculture presents more benefits than challenges? For the purpose of time, we're just going to hang out here for a few seconds while you guys answer yes or no, and we can go from there. From your experience, Clare, where do you think people sit on this? Do you think most people answer yes or most people answer no?
I think it's going to be split. It was very interesting to see the spread of folks from the last poll. So I think that's great. This is a great place to have some discussion about regenerative agriculture and what that actually means, because I think in defining it, it allows us to sort of think about the possibilities. I think I anticipate we're going to have some conversation around the difficulty of transitioning a conventional operation to something like regenerative. I would love to talk about beginning farmers and land access. And so, there's lots to unpack policy-wise around how we make the shift. And I'll just make the assertion that regenerative agriculture can help us with a resilient food supply in the face of climate change and other pandemic-like activities around the globe.
Absolutely. So before we move on here, the poll came in. It looks like about 75% of you say yes, 25% of you say no. So not quite as half and half split there, but thank you all for participating. We have another poll coming in a little bit. But first, we're going to head into the strengths and weaknesses part of the SWOT analysis. So Clare, I don't know if you would like to start. Do you have some thoughts? Some of the questions we kind of had was, why is regenerative agriculture the way to go?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as I've mentioned personally, it was the only way to go to have a farm in the community where I live. So when I started farming, I was ready to do something a little bit more conventional. We had a rain event, which was 8 inches of rain in 24 hours. I was flooded out. I couldn't plant until July, and I realized that this was never going to work as a farm if I didn't adopt some different strategies. I looked at traditional ways of producing food here in the Chequamegon Bay region where I live, which is Anishinaabe territory, and looked at wetland agriculture from the work that they'd been doing for centuries. And that was kind of one step forward. So thinking about the ways that we can produce food in unusual spaces. We need to relocalize food systems. We have a lot of new interest in urban agriculture, which Rod will talk about, I'm sure. And then thinking about the way that resilient local food systems are the backbone of a rural economy, and the ways that we can support that kind of rural economic development, which also make us more resilient in terms of climate change or other crises.
Okay, and I see you guys are figuring out how to upvote those questions, so keep that coming, and we'll get to them in a few seconds. Rod, do you have any thoughts on that? So why regenerative agriculture is the way to go?
Yeah, I think, again, just from my opening comments about kind of making a mindset around health, and I loved how Claire put it, like regenerative ag is a healing system, like a self-healing system, as opposed to something that sustains. And so we know that we're building into what we have currently. And yeah, and so I think we have to come in with that idea that we're going to build the ecosystem, the biodiversity, and all of this ecosystem function. And I think one of the best ways to do that is through the lens of regenerative agriculture. And I think Claire and I were chatting too, like regenerative agriculture is an umbrella term as far as I'm concerned. So it incorporates organics, it incorporates minimum tillage, biodynamic, agroecology. All of those are part of it. And so, like, important to recognize that, like, it's not a silver bullet, but it's a category of practice and behavior. And again, I really want to highlight the fact that it's a decision, because if you get into it and you haven't come in with that decision, when the going gets tough, you're going to kind of cave on some of those principles in order to just survive. And it's interesting. So a lot of the farms that we work with through YYC Growers, they almost refer to it as a calling. And so that kind of really anchors them into doing the best for the environment. Yeah, so I think yes, important to jump in.
And I'm going to jump right into a audience question here. So, and I think this fits quite well into the strengths and weaknesses portion of this discussion here, but setting aside the very valid comments with respect to nutrition and environmental concerns, can you comment on the cost of regenerative farming versus large-scale commercial farming? Many Canadians struggle to afford groceries every week and cannot afford to pay more. I see, Rod, you're nodding along. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the cost piece is always a fascinating one, and I saw Claire put up her finger too, and happy to share that space with her. But one of the things that we often will look at is, or a lot of the times that question comes out of kind of the emergency mindset. And yes, there are people that cannot afford the high quality food that we're talking about, but there are so again, like, this is when you think systemically, there are people that carry that as their passionate piece in the world. And so, like, even in Calgary, Zay Mamdani has the Calgary Food Security Fund that she is really aiming to try and build that bridge between kind of populations that have the need with local produced high quality food. And so her fund is there to kind of make sure that the farmers aren't doing this as volunteers, but creating that access to the food. The other thing that I want to say about that is, is when we talk about costs and put that as our lens forward, what we're neglecting to do is kind of take into account the subsidies that are creating that cheap food. And so those subsidies are actually, not thinking about the future, so we can maybe get cheap food to people today at the expense of having anything to feed people in 50 years.
Claire, you're nodding along. Would you like to add something to it?
Yeah. So I'll just start at the federal level. So here in the United States, again, same as Canada, we have funded cheap commodities. We have not funded nutritious food for people. Most of the subsidies are going for things like ethanol production and grain for animal feed in industrial settings. So that is a federal choice that we have made, and that is one of the major barriers. Now, that is in the backdrop of the fact that the price of food as a percentage of our incomes is the lowest in the world, and so we as a society have privileged cheap food at the expense of food that is grown in a way that will continue to be grown, as Rod said. So what do we do in the vacuum of that federal policy, which is going to take a long time to change? On a regional level, we are establishing food policy councils, and there's examples in Canada as well, that look at linking up how we get access to good food and also pay right livelihood to the farmers. So this ability to access food has got to come out of all of society and not be an added burden to the farmers who are already not making an income. So in the United States, something like 98% of farms have off-farm income to make ends meet because income is not keeping up with the work. And so at a very local level, as one example, our CSA Guild here in my region fundraised with the local church community, and the food bank purchased shares from all of us to give to people who access the food bank. That was the first time those folks had fresh, nutritious local food. Otherwise, they're getting the things that Walmart is throwing out. And so there's a couple different scales at which we can address that problem. But that is not a problem of the production method. That is a problem of the way our economic system values food and also values some basic things like the Earth life support systems, and there's a whole other conversation about ecological economics. And I will just mention here that Rod and I put together a little resource sheet for everyone. So after this chat in a couple days, you'll get a table with some links to some of the things we've talked about in this conversation.
As I was muted, I should probably not be the one muting myself. Hey, that's terrific, Claire and Rod. Though that's I'm sure our audience will very much appreciate those resources. So, like I said, keep an eye out on your email for that. And I know Claire and Rod are always happy to have questions come to them as well. And speaking of questions, I'm still seeing yours coming in, so keep them coming. It's great to be able to answer them, and keep upvoting the ones that you're finding interesting. So I have a question for you guys. How does regenerative ag fit into the future of ag? So at what scale, in what context, what products? It's a conversation, we go, okay, this is great, but how do we actually implement these? What are some of your comments there? Claire, maybe you want to.
Sure, I could jump in first. From my point of view, it's the only future of agriculture. We have been facing climate change already for the last 20 years here in Wisconsin. And the production methods that we need to be able to keep producing food are going to change dramatically. Whether that's, and that's at all scales. That's at the scale that I'm operating at. That's at the scale that I see very commonly in our Midwestern farming organization. Everything from grain to animals, beef. There are some fascinating models out there around how to get to a viable farm and protect the ecological functions of the system, because the more we protect those ecological functions, the less inputs we need to have in the system, whether that's pest control or weed management or animal fodder, whatever it is. So one example here in the Midwest is an organization called Tree Range Chicken. They raise meat birds and laying hens and sell those products as they're establishing hazelnut fields. The hazelnuts will be a whole other source of income, and also oil, a very high dollar crop, perennial system that holds the soil in place and protects the watershed. And so there's sort of this ramping up. When I did my dissertation with the women farmers here in the Midwest, it was about a 10-year process to become a viable business, which is that doesn't happen in any other industry. It happens in the arts, where it takes 10 years for you to be good at your craft, whether it's a musician or a visual artist. And so, but we don't think about farming that way necessarily. So it's things like land incubation of new farmers. It's organizations like Young Farmers Coalition here in the US and Young Agrarians in Canada. It's making sure that we have land back opportunities. As I'm sure this is similar in Canada right now. In US, the average age of farmers is more than 65. And so we're going to see a massive land transfer in the next decade. And who is that going to go to, and what kind of farming practices will be there? And that's a conversation we need to have at all scales. Rod, I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, and I think we're pretty aligned, Claire and I. We discovered, and I think in terms of the future, one of the big impacts for me was in 2017 when the UN put out the report that we've got 60 harvests remaining, and they did no magic. They just followed the graph of soil loss. And if you've read David Mackenzie's book Dirt, the rise and fall of civilizations, you recognize that civilizations were destroyed because they destroyed their soil. And so I think this does become the foundation of the future of agriculture. And I think even like, so we practice regenerative, like we're in it, we're called, I would say, Claire and I, and yet you can even look at the conventional system, and there's all kinds of innovation around reducing fertilizer inputs, so that there's not this waste of nitrogen fertilizer that gets washed into waterways and destroys the aquifers and pollutes. With the green zone down in the States there, where it's just like nitrogen that's washed into the bay and now is killing these other ecosystems. So I think the future really is recognizing that we depend on biodiversity for our own vitality. That's the same with our own gut microbiome as it is with the earth microbiome. So one of my issues is that I kind of realized like gluten is a problem, but as I dug into it more deeply, realizing that like our practice of desiccating crops before we harvest the wheat is actually what has created kind of leaky gut for me. And so I have to stay away from that kind of material. Alberta Health Services says, glyphosate is fine. It's safe for human consumption, and maybe they're looking at a graph that says, looks at the population as a number, as opposed to as me individually. So when you have an individual story that's involved in kind of trying to create your own vitality, you need a different system. So you recognize that the policy at the policy level, their version of health is not enough to kind of make sure that I have health. And am I a canary in the coal mine? Who knows? But there's a whole host of us that are having compromised health outcomes. And so I think if we want health, we have to adopt a system that is a self-healing system. And so I think it is the future. Can we provide food-like products and keep people alive? Yes. But do we want to keep people alive, or do we want to create a system where we're all thriving? And so I think that's part of what's going on there. So yeah, I think it's a huge part of the future of agriculture. And I'm sure there's many other things that I should be thinking about right now, but I'm going to stop talking and you can give us another question, Kara.
Maybe I could just jump right back in because I think maybe this is the moment to mention this too, because I imagine this is on people's minds too. So let's talk about production and efficiency and producing food in great quantity. As we look at population increase, there's a lot of discussion around, what model will best feed the world, right? So I just want to name a couple of things. First of all, the world feeds itself just fine, as long as we don't intervene with war, with production systems that don't apply to the culture, with contaminants that destroy the biodiversity in fields that were people's, green nutrition salad mix, etc. There's a lot of long-term research at this point showing that, for example, organic agriculture is just as productive as conventional agriculture and more productive in times of distress. So whether that's drought or insect outbreaks or whatever it is. And so that's an area where there's always more work to be done and more research to be done and more models to figure out. And that's sort of the joy of farming for me, at least. And so it's a question of where do we want to go rather than what are we working against? So where we want to go is a resilient food supply in the face of climate change. And hey, maybe we could even, as agriculture, have a positive impact on climate change if we can sequester carbon in the soil at a massive quantity. And that research is out there too. There's books like Grass Soil Hope, which talk about that and rotational grazing. So that's part of the equation too, that we need to always be looking at that data.
And I wanted to just jump into, I remembered what it was, is that the future of regenerative ag is these deeply interconnected kind of local nodes of farmers. And already we're seeing, so I'm in two different kind of geeking out soil groups of farmers who are doing deep dives into kind of listening to their land, getting soil tests, trying to improve the soil's inherent function, ecosystem function on its own. So like we can keep contributing and then the soil will take care of itself at some level. I mean, as long as we're balancing, when we're taking things out, we know that we always have to be putting something back in. And so farmers are very, very active in kind of the new social platforms and kind of inspiring each other to kind of keep digging into what they need to do. Like being a farmer right now requires a lot of intellect, and Claire mentioned at the beginning, like a lot of different hats as well. And so soil scientist is one of those, ecosystem, ecologist is another one. And I think that also is part of the future because again, it's a systemic approach that we need to take.
I'm gonna have to cut you off there because it's we have to move on to the next session. I know you guys both said this is something we could have a discussion about all day, and I appreciate your you guys expanding on this very much so. But we're gonna head into the next section here. So we did kind of the strengths and weaknesses. Now we're gonna move into opportunities and threats. Now, when we're looking at some of the opportunities, I know a question here that somebody has kind of posed says, where do you see large ruminants fitting into regenerative ag? How might large ruminant production need to change in your view? What downsides would there be to a switch like that in the livestock sector? So are there any opportunities there?
Yeah, huge. So the Savannah Institute here in the States has done a lot of research on especially large ruminants in savanna-like environments, and the opportunity there to sequester carbon, so if we can take tillage out of the equation, that immediately helps sequester carbon and keep the soil mycorrhiza, especially intact, right? The fungal network that's there that provides so many benefits. And so they've done a ton of research. So I'd recommend that resource. I don't want to go too deep into all of that science, but there's a lot out there. It is totally feasible. And learning from other grazers is huge. I think there is a learning curve, and so again, where soil conservation services can fund things here in the States, they fund a lot of basic infrastructure for farmers to transition to grazing situations, and learning it from other farmers as grazers is huge, because the genetics of those animals is different when you're privileging grazing animals compared to animals that are bred to sort of withstand a confined operation. It's different genetics, it's different breeds, and it's them also relearning or learning over time. So animals have an amazing intelligence for their environment, and so figuring out how they pass that on to the next generation is really critical too. So it takes some time. Rod?
Yeah, and I think just a case example here in southern Alberta is Casey Taves and his family that are part of Fishburne Ranch, and so some of the benefits that they've seen, they do completely a grass-fed operation, and what they're recognizing, so they're doing the mob stock grazing, small paddock grazing, which allows the cattle to come in, get the high protein grasses, they poop and they stomp, and then they move off, and then the poop and kind of knocked down grasses decompose, and so soil gets built. And I think because so the great opportunity is that ruminants have this great capacity to build soil if you've managed them correctly. I grew up on a mixed farm, and we would just run the cattle out in one spot. The grass was this high, which also means that the roots are that shallow as well, and so we were degrading the environment. And so like the practices for keeping ruminants is something that you have to really pay attention to, and so mimicking the bison is part of that. And with Casey's example in particular, what they've actually recognized is that some of the ancient plant materials have actually started coming back in that southern region because they've created the environment where that ecosystem now is functioning as itself. It's kind of come back to itself, as opposed to kind of how we've extracted. And so I think the real piece, like I know Kiss the Ground says it's not the cow, it's the how. And so cows do have a bad rap right now, and there is a lot of methane produced, and so I think for me, one of the opportunities is actually to really adjust practices in large cattle feeding operations. So that's where things are concentrated, and the methane and then the waste product is actually at toxic levels for the environment. And so like contrast that system with what Casey is doing, and you see like the two different approaches and the huge opportunity that grass fed. Now the flip side is that Casey has more offspring than he can market, and so like there's a growing need for, and a huge opportunity, I think, to then take grass fed and grass finished beef and start moving them into more of the distribution channels, so that more people get access to this meat, which then is also like balanced on your omega-3 and omega-6, but we don't need to get into that. It's just better meat because cows are eating what they're supposed to eat, and then that means that it's better nutrition for us as humans too.
So looking at a couple more opportunities here, how can regenerative agriculture fit into large crop production such as wheat, barley, or canola? We're talking on a lot of these cases, smaller scale farms. How do we actually bring this, and do we need to bring this to the large scale?
Yeah, there's some great examples in the Midwest, in the Dakotas here, of that. The question is always, what is the right scale? And the answer is, it depends. What's the right scale for vegetables? That could be a variety of answers. And grain is the same way. So grain is the sort of global big sector in agriculture, and that is a place. It's an opportunity to have a massive impact on climate change in particular, and soil health, and reducing the effects of things like the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico and other places too. We have it in Lake Michigan here in the Great Lakes because of actually that's not grain, that's dairy. But there's a lot of great examples of minimum tillage, organic with organic. So when I say minimum tillage, I don't mean burning it down with an herbicide, which is still destroying the soil system. There are examples of more diverse rotations, and so the policy and infrastructure side of that equation is we need to build our domestic markets for some of the small grains that would be in rotation with wheat and some other grains that we're more familiar with. But right now we have most of those other grains that would be in that rotation go overseas. And so can we figure out how, like we've done with corn, can we figure out multiple products for these other grain types so that we have a good rotation over a large acreage that includes years in pasture or moving to even perennial grains. So Kernza is trialing right now all over the Midwest here from the Land Institute and other partners, research partners. That's very fascinating, where we might go with perennial grain. Very complicated science equation, which I won't get into here, but yeah, Rod?
Yeah, I think one of the threats to that, Kara, is the fact that our insurance policies currently do not allow you to cover to multi-species crop, and that's one of the foundations of regenerative agriculture. And so, if you are afraid of the extreme weather events and need to have insurance so that you as a family can survive, you're going to get the crop insurance, which then says you've got to only do wheat or only do canola in that stand. And so a lot of this came to my attention through a fellow named Stuart Chutter, who's here in Calgary and works with the insurance, and he's aiming to try and get those policies changed. And so if there's any policy wonks on that's probably not a very good term, policy geniuses in this call, there's interest in kind of interest in doing that. And then one of the farms that I've been inspired by is Borderland. I think it's in southern Manitoba, so probably not, well, yeah, southern Manitoba, and they do multi-species cropping for everything that they plant. And actually met another guy at the Regenerative Ag Lab that is just kind of convening here in Alberta through rural roots to climate solutions. Met a gentleman named Shorty Fensky, who is also really kind of driving forward the fact that if we have multiple roots in the soil, each one of those plants are doing a different thing with the ecosystem, and you're getting it's not just 1 + 1 in that situation. 1 + 1 is more than 2 for these opportunities. But you have to be willing to kind of take the risk currently without the blanket of an insurance policy. So I think there's huge opportunities. And then another company that I just ran into they're out of Tisdale, Saskatchewan, north of Saskatoon, and they are taking compost, so city generated waste compost, and they're reactivating it, making sure that the microbial kind of component is high, but also the fungal component. And they've figured out a way to dehydrate that, create it into pellets, and then you can put that into your conventional system through your seed drill. And so it's like putting little tiny packs of compost next to your seed. And their trials already have shown that in the conventional synthetic system, you get 60 bushels to the acre on a barley example, whereas with their system, they got 104 bushels to the acre without doing anything different, just adding their little composted pellets. So I think there's new innovation that's happening that is really, in a sense, wooing anyone that is in a conventional system to come into this space, because every farmer across the country knows that soil is their resource, and they're not doing anything to harm it intentionally, but they are trying to make a living. And so like the more and more that we develop innovation that is in line with nature, I think, you know, you're going to have farmers lining up ready to kind of make that transition.
Absolutely. Okay, we are very quickly running out of time here. This has been a terrific conversation. We're not letting you go just quite yet, but I'm gonna head into our third poll. So now that we have kind of had this conversation and had a little bit of discussion surrounding it, my question to you guys, the audience, is after what you just heard, do you think regenerative agriculture presents more benefits than challenges? So as you can see, this just popped up on your screen. You can answer yes or no. Now, last time, Claire, I asked you what you thought. Rod, what do you think people are going to answer on this one?
Well, because they went 3/4 in favor before, I'm going to say that people are creatures of habit. It's going to be 75-25 split.
Okay, we will just wait for these answers to come in here, and then we can go from there.
And if it's more, then I feel like Claire and I deserve like a biscuit or something.
Well, I will.
Hey, wow.
There you go. So 81% says yes, and 19% says no. So interesting split there. But yeah, we are creatures of habit. I agree there, Rod. So,
but also responsive, and I thank you for taking in the information that Clara and I have been sharing. Absolutely,
we change the minds. Now, before I let you guys go, I know you two are both have a lot of thoughts going on. Any kind of last remarks you'd like to share with the audience?
I guess I would say that there are models, there's so much creativity and new strategies coming out right now around regenerative agriculture that it's worth for folks for that 19%. It's definitely worth talking to folks in the field who are doing it and seeing the examples and wrestling with the tough equations. There's a lot that we can do with cooperatives, with regional partnerships, and if our national governments sort of get out of the way, we can really move this dial forward.
Absolutely, Rod.
Yeah, I think for me, because I think one of the visions that I have is like these really hyper connected nodes of regenerative practice happening. And so I would really kind of encourage people to kind of find those conversations that are happening in their local region, become part of those efforts. And here in Calgary, like YYC Growers, we're very dedicated to kind of raising not only the practices on the farmer side, but the education and understanding of just how I'm going to say magical. I mean, it's scientific, but it feels like magic sometimes when the soil gets pumping in its own ecosystem. But educating our local customers, eaters, about the capacity of that and how that then translates into just this cascade of benefits in our ecosystem and in our kind of our own health. So I think finding those connection points, like it really is, in a sense, a movement. And I think we don't, as farmers, we need people that are as passionate on the consumption side as we are on the production side. And so I think that's a huge piece. And so I think we need more kind of organizations like YYC Growers that are kind of raising the tide on both sides, the supply and the demand. And I think as we work that in a collective way, then we can actually scale the impact of regenerative ag.
Thank you very much to both of you for all your insight today. It's been a really interesting conversation, and thanks to the audience for your guys's. I know there's a lot of questions there that have not been answered. Like I said, we ran out of time, but I know both Claire and Rod, like I said, are welcome to questions. So Rod, how do they get a hold of you?
Yeah, probably the easiest is rod@yycgrowers.com. I can throw that in the chat.
Perfect. And Claire, how do they get a hold of you?
Yeah, if you look up Elsewhere Farm on the web, you'll find my farm and my email and phone contacts. And
Okay.
I'm on Facebook too with videos if you're working at a small scale like I am.
Perfect. Okay, sounds good. And of course, a huge shout out. We'd like to thank the UFA and the RCF for their sponsorship of this public education series. It's great to be able to have your guys' support. So thank you very much. As well as for our audience, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording, information on upcoming webinars, and the Simpson Centre for Food and Agricultural Policy can be found at www.policyschool.ca/webinars. As well, I know this is going to be available on our YouTube page as well, so be tuned into that. Okay, thank you all very much, and talk to you guys at the next webinar.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.